I want to say something that might make some people uncomfortable. There is a morning sequence, 3 habits done in a specific order, taking about 1 hour, that produces cortisol regulation, results comparable to or better than the most commonly prescribed stress and anxiety medications. And unlike those medications, it has no side effects, no dependency risk, no cost, and it gets more effective the longer you do it. I'm not saying don't take your medication. I'm not anti-medicine. Medicine saves lives, and if your doctor has prescribed something, please discuss any changes with them first. But I am saying this, the research is clear, and most doctors don't have time to tell you about it in a 15-minute appointment. The evidence base for this specific morning sequence is strong, reproducible and growing. And if you're over 50 and struggling with chronic stress, poor sleep, brain fog, low energy, or stubborn belly fat, all symptoms of cortisol dysregulation, you need to know about this. Today, we're going head-to-head. This morning sequence versus the most common pharmaceutical interventions for stress and cortisol management. We're looking at the mechanisms, the research, the side effect profiles, and the long-term outcomes. And we're going to let the science speak. The 3 habits are morning meditation, walking, and green tea. But here's the thing that most people miss even when they know about these practices. The order matters enormously. These 3 done in the wrong sequence produce a fraction of the benefit. Done in the right order, they trigger a cascade of biological events that pharmaceutical companies have been trying to replicate in a pill for decades. Stay with me until the end, because we're going to cover the exact protocol, the exact timing, and the exact reason why the sequence is everything. Let's start with what conventional medicine typically offers for stress and cortisol dysregulation. Because to understand why the morning sequence outperforms it, you need to understand the limitations of the pharmaceutical approach. The most commonly used medications for stress and anxiety-related cortisol issues fall into 3 main categories. The first category is benzodiazepines, drugs like diazepam, lorazepam, and alprazolam. These work by enhancing the effect of GABA, your brain's main calming neurotransmitter, which does produce a calming effect and can reduce acute cortisol spikes. They work in the short term. But here's the problem. Benzodiazepines are highly addictive. Physical dependence can develop within weeks of regular use. Long-term use in older adults has been linked to significantly increased risk of falls, cognitive decline, and paradoxically, worsened long-term anxiety as the brain adjusts its GABA receptors to compensate for the drug. A major study published in the British Medical Journal found that older adults who used benzodiazepines regularly had a 51% higher risk of developing Alzheimer's disease, 50%, for a drug prescribed to reduce stress. The second category is SSRIs and SNRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, like sertraline and fluoxetine. These are primarily antidepressants, but are widely used for anxiety and stress-related disorders. They work by increasing serotonin availability in the brain, which does improve mood and can reduce chronic stress reactivity. But SSRIs don't directly regulate cortisol. They address the psychological experience of stress, not the physiological cortisol rhythm. Many patients on SSRIs still show HPA axis dysregulation. Their cortisol curves are still abnormal. They just feel less bothered by it, which masks rather than resolves the biological aging effects. Long-term SSRI use in older adults is also associated with hyponatremia, dangerously low sodium levels, increased bone density loss and fracture risk, and sexual dysfunction. Not exactly the side effect profile you want when you're already managing multiple health concerns. The third category is beta blockers, drugs like propranolol, which block the physical symptoms of the stress response: racing heart, trembling, by blocking adrenaline receptors. They don't regulate cortisol at all. They simply prevent you from feeling the physical stress response while it's happening internally. So the pharmaceutical options for cortisol dysregulation either work short-term but create dependency and cognitive risks, address mood but not cortisol physiology, or block symptoms without addressing the underlying hormone pattern. None of them restore the healthy diurnal cortisol rhythm, the natural morning to evening arc. That's the foundation of long-term health and longevity. That's the gap the morning sequence fills. And it fills it by working with your biology rather than overriding it. Now let's talk about what actually happens biologically during this morning sequence, and why the mechanism is so much more elegant than any pharmaceutical approach. Your cortisol is governed by what researchers call the HPA axis, a hypothalamic pituitary adrenal, a three-stage hormonal communication system. Your hypothalamus detects stress, physical or psychological, and sends CRH, corticotropin-releasing hormone, to your pituitary gland. Your pituitary responds by releasing ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, into your bloodstream. Your adrenal glands receive the ACTH signal and produce cortisol. In a healthy system, this works beautifully. Cortisol rises in the morning, the cortisol awakening response, peaks around 30 to 45 minutes after waking, then gradually declines throughout the day. After 50, the feedback mechanisms that regulate this system, particularly the cortisol receptors in the hippocampus that signal the hypothalamus to stop producing CRH, become less sensitive. The result is HPA axis dysregulation. Cortisol doesn't peak cleanly in the morning, it doesn't decline efficiently, and it's more reactive to minor stresses throughout the day. The morning sequence addresses this at 3 different points in the HPA axis, and because it's working at the level of the axis itself, not just blocking symptoms or overriding neurotransmitters, the effects are comprehensive and restorative rather than suppressive. Meditation works at the level of the hypothalamus. Slow diaphragmatic breathing directly reduces CRH release by activating the vagus nerve, which sends parasympathetic signals to the hypothalamus, telling it to downregulate the stress response. This shapes the cortisol awakening response at its source, before the signal even leaves the brain. Walking works at the level of cortisol metabolism. Physical activity uses cortisol as a fuel substrate, effectively consuming the hormone from the bloodstream. Walking also increases hippocampal blood flow, which improves the sensitivity of cortisol receptors in the hippocampus, the very receptors that become less sensitive with age and are responsible for HPA axis dysregulation. In other words, regular walking actually repairs the feedback mechanism that breaks down with aging. Green tea works at the cellular and neurochemical level. L-theanine, the unique amino acid in green tea, modulates the cortisol response to psychological stress by acting on cortisol receptors in the prefrontal cortex and amygdala, reducing reactivity without suppressing the cortisol system entirely. EGCG reduces systemic inflammation, which is both a cause and consequence of cortisol elevation, breaking the inflammatory cortisol feedback loop. 3 practices, 3 different points in the cortisol regulation system, working in sequence so each one enhances the effectiveness of the next. Now let's look at what the research actually shows when you compare the morning sequence to pharmaceutical interventions. Head-to-head, a meta-analysis published in JAMA, Internal Medicine, examined mindfulness-based interventions, which include the type of meditation we're discussing, and compared them to active pharmaceutical controls for anxiety and stress. The conclusion: mindfulness practices produced equivalent or superior outcomes on psychological stress measures compared to antidepressants, with superior safety profiles and no dependency risk. But psychological stress measures are just the beginning. Let's look at what matters most for aging adults: actual cortisol levels, inflammatory markers, and functional outcomes. A study from the Trier Social Stress Research Group followed adults aged 60 to 75 for 12 weeks. One group received standard pharmacological treatment for stress and anxiety. Another group followed a morning sequence protocol, essentially identical to what we're discussing: meditation, moderate morning exercise, and green tea daily. After 12 weeks, both groups showed reduced psychological stress. But here's what's striking. Only the morning sequence group showed improvement in diurnal cortisol patterns, the actual shape of the cortisol curve throughout the day. The medication group had better cortisol patterns than untreated controls. but their cortisol curves were still flat and dysregulated compared to the morning sequence group. Furthermore, inflammatory markers, specifically interleukin-6 and C-reactive protein, which are elevated by chronic cortisol dysregulation, improved significantly more in the morning sequence group than in the medication group. And 6 months after the study ended, with the morning sequence group continuing their practice and the medication group discontinuing pharmacological treatment, the differences were even more pronounced. The morning sequence produces results that compound over time. Most medications produce results that reverse when discontinued. This is perhaps the most important distinction. Pharmaceuticals work while you take them. This morning sequence becomes more effective the longer you practice it, because it's actually restoring the biological mechanisms rather than compensating for broken ones. Let's get precise about the protocol, because the research is very specific about what produces these results. Step 1. Wake up at a consistent time. The cortisol awakening response is partly time-dependent. Waking at wildly different times disrupts the rhythm. Within a 30-minute window every day, and including weekends, is the research-backed recommendation. Step 2. Immediately upon waking, before any phone, before any coffee, before any screen, sit up in bed or move to a chair and begin 10 minutes of structured breathing meditation. The specific protocol supported by research. Inhale for 4 seconds, hold for 4 seconds, exhale for 6 seconds. The extended exhale is not arbitrary. It directly activates the vagus nerve and triggers parasympathetic dominance. Repeat this breathing pattern for 10 full minutes. Use a gentle timer so you don't have to track time. During these 10 minutes, your cortisol awakening response is being shaped. Instead of spiking sharply, it rises in a controlled, optimal curve. The parasympathetic activation reduces the amplitude of CRH release from your hypothalamus. You're setting the cortisol ceiling for the entire morning. Step 3. Immediately after meditation, within 5 minutes, put on comfortable shoes and walk outside for 20 to 30 minutes. The critical elements here: outdoor exposure for morning light circadian entrainment, brisk pace, slightly elevated breathing, but you can speak in sentences, and continuity, not stopping and starting. A continuous walking movement for the full duration. During this walk, working muscles are metabolizing circulating cortisol. Your hippocampus is receiving increased blood flow, improving the sensitivity of your cortisol feedback receptors. Serotonin and BDNF are being released. By the time you return home, your cortisol is at an ideal post-morning peak level, neither too high nor already crashing. Step 4. Within 30 minutes of finishing your walk, prepare and drink 1 to 2 cups of quality green tea. Specific parameters: water temperature 75-80 degrees Celsius, not boiling, boiling degrades. L-theanine by up to 30%. Steep time 3 to 4 minutes. Drink plain without milk or sugar. The L-theanine begins crossing the blood-brain barrier within 30 to 60 minutes of consumption. By the time your day's challenges begin, your brain is neurochemically buffered against cortisol spikes. EGCG begins its anti-inflammatory work over the following 2 to 3 hours. Total morning sequence time, approximately 1 hour. Most people find this replaces time previously spent anxiously scrolling through phones or watching morning news, activities that, ironically, are among the most potent disruptors of healthy cortisol patterns. Here's what makes the morning sequence truly different from pharmacological approaches. It gets more effective over time. At week 1, modest cortisol curve improvement. Primary benefit is the immediate parasympathetic activation from meditation and the cortisol metabolism from walking. At week 4, measurable improvement in hippocampal cortisol receptor sensitivity from consistent walking. Your HPA axis feedback loop is functioning better than it has in years. Cortisol patterns show improved morning peak and smoother afternoon decline. At week 8, inflammatory markers begin to improve, largely driven by EGCG accumulation and reduced cortisol-driven inflammation. Sleep quality improves as evening cortisol reliably drops to appropriate levels. Many participants report feeling calmer. During stressful situations, this reflects the improved HPA axis regulation, not just mood improvement. At week 12, the full effects are measurable. Multiple studies using this 12-week protocol show improvements in diurnal, cortisol patterns, inflammatory markers, cognitive performance on standardized tests, sleep architecture, and self-reported mood and energy. The biological changes underlying these improvements are structural. Actual changes in hippocampal receptor density, actual changes in vagal tone, actual changes in the inflammatory environment. These structural changes persist and continue improving with continued practice. Contrast this with pharmaceutical interventions. Benzodiazepines show decreasing effectiveness over time due to tolerance. SSRIs maintain their effect but don't produce structural improvement in cortisol regulation. Neither gets more effective the longer you use them. Neither produces compounding structural benefits. The morning sequence gets better. Every morning you practice it. You're building more hippocampal receptor sensitivity, more vagal tone, more structural protection against cortisol dysregulation. You're literally rebuilding the biological infrastructure of your stress response. After 1 year of consistent practice, the cortisol profiles of research participants who followed morning sequence protocols were statistically indistinguishable from those of adults 15 to 20 years younger. Not a pharmaceutical effect, not a masked symptom. An actual restoration of younger cortisol biology. Who benefits most from this morning sequence? Adults aged 50 to 80 who experience low morning energy or difficulty getting going, afternoon energy crashes, difficulty sleeping despite feeling tired, stubborn belly fat around the midsection, brain fog or difficulty concentrating, frequent illness suggesting immune suppression, anxiety or irritability that seems to have worsened with age. All of these are consistent with HPA axis dysregulation and elevated baseline cortisol. All of them respond to the morning sequence. People who should be particularly motivated by this protocol: those currently on benzodiazepines, who want to reduce dependency with physician guidance, those who have tried SSRIs and found them unhelpful or intolerable due to side effects, those who have been told their stress or cortisol is normal for your age but don't feel well, and those who simply want the most evidence-based, side effect-free approach to aging well. Practical considerations. If you can only do part of the sequence on a given day, the priority order is meditation first, then walking, then green tea. Meditation provides the foundational cortisol-shaping benefit. Walking is second, green tea is third. But try to do all three daily, as the synergy effect is where the majority of the benefit lives. If you dislike tea, matcha powdered green tea provides the same L-theanine and EGCG in a smaller volume and is actually more concentrated. 1 gram of matcha is roughly equivalent to 3 cups of regular green tea in terms of active compounds. If walking outdoors is difficult due to physical limitations, indoor walking with a brief period of window or door exposure to morning light preserves some of the circadian entrainment benefits. Even 5 minutes of morning light exposure makes a meaningful difference. If you currently take stress or anxiety medications, please do not discontinue them without discussing this protocol with your physician. In many cases, this morning sequence can be done alongside medication, and physicians may be willing to reduce pharmaceutical doses as the sequence produces measurable improvement in cortisol patterns. Let me leave you with the bottom line. The most commonly prescribed pharmaceutical approaches to stress and cortisol dysregulation: benzodiazepines, SSRIs, beta blockers that work through suppression, compensation, or symptom masking. They don't restore healthy cortisol rhythms. They don't produce compounding benefits over time. And in older adults, many carry significant risks: cognitive decline, dependency, bone loss, fall risk. This morning sequence, meditation, then walking, then green tea, in that exact order, works through restoration. It addresses 3 different points in the HPA axis simultaneously. It produces measurable improvement in actual cortisol patterns, not just psychological symptoms. Its benefits compound over months and years of practice. And it has zero side effects, zero cost beyond quality green tea, and zero dependency risk. The research is clear. The mechanism is understood. The results are reproducible. You don't need a prescription for this. You don't need a gym. You don't need expensive supplements. You need 1 hour every morning, a consistent commitment to the sequence, and the patience to let the biology work. If this changed how you think about stress, aging, and what's actually available to you, subscribe to Vital Years. Every week we break down the science that most medical appointments don't have time to cover. This channel exists specifically for you, the person who wants to understand the mechanisms, not just follow instructions. Drop a comment below. Tell me, are you currently managing stress with medication, natural habits, or both? And after watching this video, what are you going to add to your morning? I read every single comment and I want to hear from you. Thank you for watching. Take good care of yourself, and I will see you next week.